Thank you for an extremely handsome, generous introduction, during which I began to feel like, as I surveyed the audience also, and having been listening to your music, a bit like a Daniel being introduced to a den of, I'm sure, very charming lion cubs. A different experience from my common one. Let's get straight to it because time presses. There are, I suppose, three forms of the divine, and if you eliminate polytheism, which I think we may as well all do for today's purposes, there are two ways of approaching it. One is the deistic, and one is the theistic. I hope I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but if you don't know it, it's useful, and it's a very important opening distinction. There are those, there have been those, among them were many of the founders of our great republic, in particular Mr. Thomas Jefferson, who were not Christians, but who were deists. They believed that the evidence of the universe and of nature showed a designer, seemed to imply it by its patterns and repetitions. A very, very common usage in those days was that of the watch, which later turns up in Mr. Paley's Natural Theology, which for many, many years was the central Christian text in the argument for design. He says very simply, if you're an Aborigine and you're walking along a beach and you find a pocket watch ticking away, you don't know what it's for. You have no education that would enable you to judge its purpose, but you can tell it's not a rock, and you can tell it's not a vegetable, and you can tell it's been made by someone for some purpose. That much you must know, even if you know nothing else. The metaphor of the watch was very much used by the deists. And of course, watches run down and break down. And it was believed by many of them that if an intelligence had begun the universe, begun the process, he took no further interest in it. Didn't intervene in human affairs, didn't mind who won the war, didn't mind which country was the leading one, watched with relative, well, or didn't watch with indifference, plague, famine, war, and so forth. That's a very hard position to oppose, by the way. It's very difficult, impossible, actually, to disprove. One can only say the evidence for it isn't quite strong enough to be persuasive. To be a theist, in other words, to occupy the position that many people here currently do, and my opponent does, to be a member of a monotheistic religion that believes that truth has been revealed, that God has intervened in human affairs, that he has a plan for us, each of us individually as well as a species, and that it shows, is a very, very much more difficult undertaking. I'm going to show why I think it's more or less impossible. There are usually three ways in which people try and demonstrate it. One is looking at the cosmos, the vault of heaven, the world beyond what we can quite see or apprehend. The second is human history and its development, and the third is ourselves, our own bodies, our makeup. Again, I'll have to condense, I hope you'll forgive me, but I'll sketch in what I think the objections are. Unless you don't believe, I don't know what they've been teaching you, unless you do not believe in the theory of what is conventionally called now the Big Bang, that our universe is billions of years old and began with a gigantic explosion, which is still going on, you are forced to be very, very, very modest about what it is you can know about anything. What preoccupies most scientists now is not how much they know compared to 50 years ago, though that is enormous as a difference, but how little they know compared to what they're finding out. All these conclusions are very tentative, but minimally they must involve this. For a few milliseconds, really, of cosmic time, our species has lived on one very, very small rock in a very small solar system that's a part of a fantastically unimportant suburb in one of an uncountable number of galaxies. And that every second since the Big Bang, every single second, a star the size of our sun has blown up, gone to nothing, swelled up, shrunk into what's called a dwarf and disappeared. And that the matter of which we are made cheer up, by the way. You are all made of stardust, which is a good way of thinking about yourself. But that's the price of that stardust. And every second I've been speaking, another of those suns has gone out. And indeed, physicists now exist who can tell you the date, more or less the exact one, on which our sun will follow suit. So the old Christian revivalists who used to stand on the street corner with signs saying, "Repent, the end of the world is at hand," were in their way right. We know when it's coming to an end, and we know how it will be. But and we know something even more extraordinary, which is that the rate of expansion of this explosion we're living through is actually speeding up. Our universe is flying apart further and faster than we thought it was. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it, and everyone who studies it professionally finds it impossible to reconcile this extraordinarily destructive, chaotic, self-destructive process, to find in it the finger of God, to find in that the idea of a design. And that's not just because we know so little about it. It's because what we know about it that's essential doesn't seem as if it's the intended result brought about by a divine, benign creator who loves every single one of us, living as we do on this tiny rock in this negligible suburb of the cosmos. So, again, good luck if you want to, but if you're looking for God in the first instance, those are the difficulties you'll have to begin to encounter. If you want to take human history as a vindication, again, I'd urge great caution on you. And I'll take a non-Christian example, if I may, though I think in all cases it's a big mistake to think that your own cause or your own country or your own side has God in its corner. For one thing, it commits the sin of pride, which I know you've been warned against, what the Greeks call hubris. It is probably better, as Abraham Lincoln said, at a time when two sets of Christians were fighting over whether slavery was Christian or not, to decide the future of this union. Abraham Lincoln, who was also likewise not a Christian but a deist, if he was anything, said it might be more useful to find out if we are on God's side than whether he's on ours. But the temptation to enlist the cause of a good God is very strong. Indeed, there are many people in the world today, they're well known as jihadists, Muslim fundamentalists, people who want to kill, really do seriously want and intend to kill everyone in this room, who get the energy they've got and are willing to give their lives because they are so sure that God is with them. And if you want to believe that God intervenes on one side or another, and that God takes a hand in human history and human affairs, you have to grant it to them too. I don't know whether you're ready to do that, or you'd have to say, no, it's only true when we say so, which I think would be, wouldn't it, a rather unsatisfying argument. I'll take neither the Christians nor the Jews but the Muslims. Excuse me, neither the Christians nor the Muslims but the Jews, who say they have a covenant with God, whose testament we Christians, we Western civilization, Christians include in the Holy Book. Those who claim to have met God, or whose leader met God face to face in the Sinai Peninsula, to have received the law, to have had a direct revelation of morality from him, to have a special covenant. Now, let me just say briefly what the problem with that has been for the Jewish religious leadership. About 10 years before I was born, about 50 to 60% of the Jewish people of Europe were put to death in disgusting ways by mass murder, gassing, immolation, in Christian Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And many people wondered how God could permit this to a people who he had made a special relationship with. And many people left the synagogue as a result. They stopped going. The Jewish people are in their majority now post-religious, secular, very largely for this reason. And some rabbis were bold enough to say, no, there is a reason for this. You fell away from God and you forgot Israel, you forgot Jerusalem. It's a punishment for exile, it's a punishment for inattention to the covenant. Many people who'd seen their children burned alive said, I'm not listening to this, I'm leaving the religion. And many rabbis went quiet, thinking perhaps they shouldn't come up with any too instant explanation for such a fantastic human disaster and human crime. And they waited, and then the Israelis won a war in 1967 which got them back control of the holy places in Jerusalem. And then the rabbis blew the ram's horn again and said, no, we should have waited. Now we see the finger of God. It was all to drive us back to Palestine, where we should have always have been, and to make us the owners of Jerusalem. Now we see what the design was. Well, I dare say you read the papers and watch the news. There isn't a single Israeli now who isn't wondering whether the victory in that war and the conquest of those holy places wasn't a disaster, hasn't led them into a terrible trap of endless war and confrontation in the Middle East, where their own hubris, their own occupation of other people's territory and holy places has led to a terrible impasse. There. Food, I hope, at any rate for thought. Probably the most I can do today is sow a little doubt and suggest a bit of reading. Then, our bodies. Well, again, I don't know what they've been telling you about Mr. Darwin and about where we come from and our kinship with other animal species, but I consider it a fairly settled question that our resemblance to other primates isn't exactly accidental. It's now possible to measure, in fact, in chromosomes. We are perhaps half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee, our nearest relative. All of you, when you were being born, when you were within your mother's womb, grew a coat of hair about 4 months in, and then shed it again. You don't need it anymore. All of you have an appendix that isn't needed any longer for the kind of digestion that you do. All of you have the same teeth. That's why you have to work on your wisdom teeth so much, and other things for the kind of diet other primates used to have to live on. All of you bear what Charles Darwin himself at the end of Origin of Species calls the unmistakable stamp of our lowly origin. You're a mammal, a primate. Take heart, primates can do, capable of very great things. But we are adapted to an environment, the African savanna, which we abandoned. Why did we abandon it? Because if we didn't abandon it, we were going to go extinct. There was such a climate crisis in Africa all those thousands of years ago that the tiny tribe that was then us made the very smart decision to move north and out and away. It's reckoned by the National Geographic, I recommend you look this up, that the human species was down to less than 2,000 or 3,000 people at that point. And if it had not made this move, would have gone the way of, mark this figure, would have gone the way of 99.8%. 99.8% of all other species that have ever existed on this planet and gone extinct. Now, I just rubbed that in once more. 99.8% of all the forms of life ever to appear on this terrestrial globe are gone. Wiped out. And it was nearly us. And this doesn't, to me, give the evidence of a design, of the finger of a god of any kind, let alone one who wishes us well. It rather suggests to me that nature and the world and human life are a struggle. You'll tell me when I've got, won't you, sir? A minute or two. Give me a wave. Thank you. I felt I was getting close to trespassing on Dr. Dembski's time. Now, incidentally, it's really worth your time to write off to the National Geographic. They'll send you back a kit. You scrub the inside of your cheeks, put it in a solution, send it back. They will show you a map of where your ancestors came from in Africa and at what time and what route they took to get to where you are now. It will be very eye-opening. I strongly suggest you do it. While I have your attention, I also suggest on the matter of evolution that you read a book by Dr. Francis Collins called The Language of God. Dr. Collins, as you may know, ran the Human Genome Project, which analyzed our kinship with other animals, and we now know the whole extent of our genetic code and ID, including the messy gaps in it that are Dr. Dembski's speciality, and brought this in ahead of time and under budget, and is the greatest student of DNA and stem cells and all that go with it who we have amongst us. I would say the greatest American living physician. I am prejudiced. He's a great friend of mine. He's also been a great help to me in my current illness. He's a great American. He's also a great Christian. That's why I recommend him to you. A very strong and believing Christian. And the chapters in his book, The Language of God, that tell you, don't waste your time not believing in evolution. Don't let anyone tell you it didn't take place. Nice, simple, clear, brilliant chapter. is a chapter you are not educated if you have not read. I'll close and say, because I've got only a minute, why wouldn't I believe in this? Why might one not want to believe in it, even if it could be true? Because my view is that it's not only not true, but it's probably a good thing it isn't. Why is it not a good thing? Because I don't think it's healthy for people to want there to be a permanent, unalterable, irremovable authority over them. I don't like the idea of a father who never goes away. And nor do you, if you think about it. When you get closer to parenthood, you won't say to your children, don't worry, I'll never die. You won't be at my funeral, I'll be at yours. I'll be at your grandchildren's funeral. You'll never hear the end of me. That's actually not loving paternity. The idea of a king who cannot be deposed, very un-American idea as well as a very undemocratic one. The idea of a judge who doesn't allow a lawyer or a jury or an appeal. This is an appeal to absolutism. It's the part of ourselves that's not so nice, that wants security, that wants certainty, that wants to be taken care of. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the human struggle for freedom was against the worst kind of dictatorship of all, the theocracy, the one that claims it has God on its side, the divine right of kings, the feudal system, the monarchical one against which the American Revolution, with its secular humanism, took place. I believe the totalitarian temptation has to be resisted, and I believe this is one of its core and origin points. And so what I'm inviting you to do is to consider emancipating yourself from the idea that you, selfishly, are the sole object of all the wonders of the cosmos and of nature, because that's not a humble idea at all. It's a very arrogant one, and there's no evidence for it. You do better to emancipate yourself from it and do some real study of genetics and biology and cosmology. And then, again, a second emancipation, to think of yourselves as free citizens who are not in thrall to any supernatural, eternal authority, which you will always find is interpreted for you by other mammals who claim to have access to this authority that gives them special power over you. Don't allow yourselves to have your lives run like that. I've exhausted my time. I'm really grateful for your attention. I can't wait to be back. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. We're going to go ahead and actually pick up cards for those of you who would like to ask a question. If you could pass those cards to the aisles, we'll have some people around to pick up those cards, and those cards will make their way up to me after we hear the rebuttals from each of our speakers. So, Mr. Hitchens, 10 minutes for rebuttal.
I'll try and do less if I can, because I'd rather reserve time for questions if possible. But yes, after all, I've been challenged on a number of fronts, and that's what I enjoy. I was trying to think of something that I agreed with, but I found I had to disagree almost ab initio, as it were. An atheist does not have to be an evolutionist. Atheism long predates the discoveries. Atheism long predates the revolutionary discoveries of Charles Darwin. There was a time when the word scientist didn't exist. Actually, the word scientist is a late 19th century coinage that I sometimes feel we could do without. In the time of Sir Isaac Newton, for example, people who did the work of the sort that he did were called natural philosophers. And I think that it's important to realize that science is not just the study of the material world or laboratories. I mean, after all, Sir Isaac Newton may have been a very, very, very great scientist, but he maintained a furnace in his room in Cambridge at all times because he was also an alchemist and believed he would one day find out how to turn base metals into gold. He's one of a long line of people who were genius crackpots. He believed, for example, that the Pope was the Antichrist. Maybe it's true. And that if you could find the measurements of the old temple, that would be far more useful than knowing what the measurements of gravity were. But he was a natural scientist. He knew absolutely nothing about evolution. the work of Spinoza, the work of Voltaire, the work of Lucretius. Admittedly, Lucretius did work out Democritus and Epicurus as well at that period of the Hellenistic period. They did work out the world was made of atoms, a very brilliant thing for them to have done at the time. The mystery to me is only this, because none of these things necessarily depend on one another, why it is that organized religion has always been so hostile to discoveries of this sort, why it should take them so personally. The work of Lucretius, De Rerum Naturam, that established that we're made of atoms, and so is the rest of the system, was hated by the church for centuries. Only about 1 or 2 copies of it were allowed to survive. They didn't want you to know this. As you know, the church didn't want Galileo to look through a tube and see, make the disconcerting discovery that the sun doesn't go round us, we go round the sun. I presume now no one is going to give me an argument about that today. Why would anyone care which way it worked? Well, because if the sun doesn't go round us, we're not the center of the universe, which makes it, doesn't it, fractionally less likely that we're the objects of the whole thing. If we revolve around something else, it could be we're not the sole object of a huge cosmic divine design. So what I've been trying to attack today, and I've given no reason to want to attack it less, is this reassuring idea that it's all about us, this solipsistic, selfish, I think, unscientific idea. The work of Darwin and later of innumerable writers, many of whom are Christian, on evolution, shows that there's absolutely no necessity at all for an incompatibility between a private belief in God and a recognition that we arose out of natural selection and random mutation. Let me just take the question of the eye. I think Dr. Dembski said I was obsessed with it. That's absolutely not true. It's simply that Darwin himself doubted at first that the eye could have evolved, given its complexity, and because the eye is the example most commonly brought up, so I thought, okay, in my book I'll take the most complex and the most difficult and the most well-known example. And you can look at my book, or you can look at a very brilliant chapter in Richard Dawkins's book, Climbing Mount Improbable, beautiful short chapter on the 25 different evolutions of the eye and the different ways in which it's taken place. I have contributed to it because I'm not a scientist. Only one small thing, but I'll give it to you anyway. You may have seen, you should have seen, a wonderful series made by the British Broadcasting Corporation called Planet Earth. It's the greatest photography of the natural world you'll ever see. It's absolutely extraordinary. And in one very fascinating case, they go to Indonesia, which has the largest caves we know underground on Earth, which have a whole series of life forms inside them, many of them not fully understood or explored yet, including a large number of life forms that we do already understand that fell into those caves when they were formed and ceased to live on the Earth's surface and in the sunlight and started to make their lives underground. They are more or less exactly the same as they would be if they had remained where they were, but I noticed the salamander, the beautiful Indonesian lizard. Everyone's seen one in a zoo. There it was. It had been living for, David Attenborough told us in the program, X millions of years away from the sunlight in a cave. It had eyes. No, it didn't. It had perfectly eye-shaped indentations, exactly where the eyes used to be, like a little sketch or outline of an eye, but no socket. The socket had gone, the eye itself had gone. All you could see was the vestigial. It had adapted. It had decided to lose its eye. Most of our studies are about how people got hold of eyes. Dawkins's is the best one, whatever Dr. Dembski may say, of the different ways in which different creatures got different eyes. But no one until your humble servant, because I wrote off to my friends and my enemies and said, has anyone noticed this before, had thought, now how do animals lose their eyes? The same way they got them, by not needing them anymore, by adapting away. If you live underground, in the wet, in the dark, it's a big hazard to your survival to have a wet, useless spot that can't receive any light, 2 of them on your face. It can pick up infection, it can make you vulnerable. You lose it. It takes millions of years, but you'll lose it. That's what we're talking about, adaptability. Wrongly it's said that Darwin talked of the survival of the fittest. People draw often cruel and inhuman conclusions from this and attribute it to Darwin. Didn't say anything of the sort. What he said is adaptability is what helps survival. If I told you that in parts of Africa where elephants are shot for their tusks, elephants are growing shorter tusks in reaction, you would, I'm sure, laugh. How would the elephant know how to do that? Elephant sees hunter, works out hunter wants tusk, is an ivory hunter, shrinks tusks to minimize chance of being shot. Don't be ridiculous. Well, no, that isn't, of course, what happens. What happens is the ones with long tusks get shot quite a lot. And the ones with shorter or no tusks have, therefore, greatly enhanced opportunities of being the ones who survive and breed. And their descendants actually have shorter or no tusks. That's what adaptability is. That's what evolution is. It's not some kind of trick. In the time I've got, that's the best I can do on those points, on that point, because I want to come, in what remains to me, to the allegations made about my theology. Well, the archaeologists of the State of Israel, after the 1967 war, when Israel became, for many years, the possessor of the Sinai Peninsula, it's now given it back, and of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the biblical territories, had an unprecedented opportunity to show that the Bible story was archaeologically provable. And they were told by the founding leader of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, go out, dig, find, he said, dig up the title deeds of our state. They had the strongest motive and the greatest opportunity any archaeologists have ever had. And the standard of Israeli archaeology is already extremely high, as you can tell from their national museums and the work of many great archaeologists such as Professor Finkelstein. And they had many years to do it. They couldn't find a single trace of anything that was remotely compatible with the story of the Exodus, the wandering, and the conquest of Canaan. Not one trace. On the other hand, what they could find, with the help of Egyptian archives, was enormous evidence in the opposite direction. Digging Up History is the book. It's very easy to get, very easy to read. It's a very impressive demonstration of what I call, and this is what to look for when you're looking for intellectual honesty in life, evidence against interest. In other words, people will say, I really wished, I really hoped I could find this. This was my ambition. Here is how. It wasn't compatible, wasn't doable in the light of the facts. I regard that as a very impressive piece of objective work on the part of Israeli scholarship. If you think that Jesus isn't a historical figure, it really only matters to you. What do I mean by that? For me, the most important thinker is Socrates, and the most important source of morality and philosophical comfort, by far. There's no evidence that Socrates existed either. It's not conclusive. That's to say, we only have, as we have in the case of Jesus, second-hand eyewitness reports of him. They're pretty persuasive, but they're not conclusive. He never wrote anything down, neither did Jesus. The stories about him are much more compatible than the ones of Jesus. The four Gospels contradict each other about everything from his birth, the circumstances of it, the flight into Egypt, very crucially, in all four cases, on the crucifixion and the resurrection. All of just read them for yourselves. I'm sure you must have read them by now. The discrepancies are extraordinary. They don't amount to a historical figure in the same way as we know from coinage, from building, from parchments, not parchments, but from documents, tablets, things, that Alexander the Great, for example, was a historical figure. But to me, if Socrates didn't exist, it wouldn't matter. Because we have his method, we have his teaching, and he teaches us what, I loop back now to Dr. Dembski's first element of his critique, to having to know that to be educated is to understand how little you know and how little you understand. Dr. Dembski seems to think he's laid some kind of gigantic egg that's about to hatch a huge squawking chicken, when he points out that among evolutionists and among physicists and others, there are huge differences and disagreements. That's true. It's also going to get much, much more intense. If you want to see a really strong argument take place, go and talk to Richard Dawkins and ask him about his view of Stephen Jay Gould's, another great paleontologist, arguments on punctuated evolution. There are tremendous differences within our school. There's a huge amount yet to be known or explained. But we don't take anything on faith. There's no dogma. There are no tablets. We go where the evidence leads us. And, for example, when the last outbreak of flu virus occurred, because we know something about the genetic things we have in common with bacteria and viruses, and we were able to sequence the DNA of the last such virus in 1919, didn't take us very long to get a vaccine that could prevent the last flu from being as bad as the previous one. It works. It works. You can make sound medical predictions based on it. Medicine's impossible without the work of evolution and genetics. And you should be grateful for it. But it doesn't mean there's no God. It just means that we have what we think are better explanations for our human nature. I think that runs me out perfectly.
It does.
And again, thank you for your attention.
Christopher, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes on 5 minutes on the goodness of God. Okay, never one to refuse a challenge. I don't really know what it's like being a Christian, but it seems to me that if I was one, there are reasons I would want to object to the Dembski view. First, I think this attempt to prove the existence of God by what we would normally call something like scientific evidence, which is a restless need that the religious have, I think partly because we keep taunting them with not ever coming up with enough conclusive evidence, so they keep coming up with more. I mean, after all, the Big Bang was actually originally thought of by a Catholic priest in holy orders at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and he took it to the Pope, Pope Leo, I think it was, who said, well, if you like, I'll make it official dogma. I'll say that Christians have to believe it. And the professor said, well, no, Your Holiness, that's not quite what I mean. But very often when, not in this case, but when something marvelous and various and awe-inspiring, like the theory of evolution or the theory of the Big Bang, is finally accepted by most, if not all people, Christians simply say, well, that just proves God is even more ingenious than we thought. He must be responsible for all that too. Please always beware of an argument that appears to explain everything. It's very likely to explain nothing. But there's another reason why I think I would be a little uneasy at arguments of this kind that try and wrench evidence into theological shape. This is my question for you to ponder, where's the need for faith in that case? If it can be proved in the same way as a proposition of mine has to be proved or has to fall, what need for faith? What need for the suffering, the struggle to achieve faith and maintain it? There'd be no need for faith if there really was evidence, would there? I'd love to know how you bridge this gap. Perhaps someone in the question period will supply me with a thought there. And then another reason why I would steer very clear of this idea of making God responsible, not just for our existence, but for our behavior and for what happens to us, is it dooms you to have to keep on pestering him with plaintive questions that don't have an answer. I found a complete point of agreement with Dr. Dembski. It's absolutely true. If I was a Christian, I would not think that God owed me an explanation. There'd be something disproportionate, surely, about that, something conceited. But people do find themselves asking, if there's a God and if he's good, where is all this evil from? This is a strictly time-wasting question. Things like war and pestilence come because we are not very highly evolved animals who live on a rather climatically unstable planet and don't know very much yet about our circumstances. The way that we behave to each other is recognizable from the way that other animals behave to each other, unfortunately. But we have one very clear idea, and it's fortunately one that it's almost impossible for us to get rid of, that if we don't act responsibly to one another, whether for altruistic reasons or not, the motives don't necessarily have to be pure, But if we didn't have a social dimension, a bonding one, we wouldn't survive. We'd have gone by now. We wouldn't have made it out of Africa. The question, in a sense, answers itself. Now, you can call this morality if you want, and there certainly are some individuals who act in what appears to us to be a self-sacrificing way. And they've always got tremendous honor in all tribes, in all societies, and at all times. But it's only really necessary to recognize that we have a kinship and a solidarity, and that without it we're gone. Morality cannot be dictated to us. It doesn't come in tablet form that can be swallowed. It comes from the Socratic method of moral suasion, long reflection. Why should this be called wrong? Why would this be a dishonor? Otherwise, why do the Ten Commandments say nothing about slavery, nothing about genocide, nothing about child abuse, nothing about innumerable other things that preoccupy us and make us think, of which we think as evil, and about 4 instructions on how to worship a very jealous, capricious, and ill-tempered God? How come? If you based your morality on these tablets, you'd be missing an enormous amount of what we think of as morally urgent. Now again, I happen to be a secular humanist. I have politics of my own, fairly accurately described by Dr. Dembski. That doesn't go to the question of whether there's a God or not. You can be a supporter of Ayn Rand. I'm sure some of you have read The Fountainhead, or The Virtue of Selfishness, one of her best essays, actually, though I don't agree with it, or Atlas Shrugged. Had complete contempt for religion, but politics completely different from me. You can be an atheist and a sadist. You can be an atheist and a fascist. Most fascists actually were Roman Catholics. Doesn't matter. You can be an atheist fascist. Mussolini, I think, was an atheist. Quite rare. To be a communist, a Stalinist, it's almost a necessity to be an atheist. There are as many choices as you like. All we say is there's no supernatural dimension, there's no rescue coming to us from the unseen, there's no such thing as salvation, and we are as alone as other species are in this struggle. Sorry, looking at the clock and realizing I've run it out. Can I just then have you view that as a prod to the question period? I'd be very grateful if you'd be that generous. Thank you.
Well, the first question, and these are for both of you to respond to. Obviously, they're kind of pointed towards one person or the other. But the first one is for Mr. Hitchens. Using the evolutionary process, where do you, and you answered this a little bit, but if you could expound on it, where does the concept of human thought and the ability to reason come in, especially in dealing with things that would seem to go against the evolutionary concept? The idea you mentioned before was self-sacrifice. Why would there continue to be something like self-sacrifice if that's not going to continue to move on to species? So where does that idea, the ability to reason, come from using evolution?
Well, I think the question may be confusing the idea of reasoning with the idea of self-sacrifice, which isn't necessarily an irrational one. My favorite example, I think, would be, because we do need an explanation, or it would be nice to have one. It's a good speculation. Why do people get pleasure from doing things that aren't necessarily in their interest, just for the sake of other people? I hope no one in this room hasn't had that feeling at a certain point. And it's very nice that we have it, along with all our predatory and selfish and other survival necessary attributes. I think my favorite example is that of giving blood. I like giving blood. I like the feeling that I'm giving someone else a life-giving fluid. I am giving it. I'm also not losing it. It doesn't take very long to replenish a pint of blood, so it's a really wonderful gift relationship to have. You haven't lost a pint, but you've given one. So there's no need for any sort of feel-good or self-congratulation about it. You haven't really made a big sacrifice, but you've taken a little time, you've thought about other people. And then I have a very, very rare blood group, and I'm very anxious that there be enough blood when it's my turn. So there's every interest in the good feeling that I have, the warm feeling that I have, being one that evolution has given me for my sake and for everybody else's. I don't think there's anything very mysterious about that, do you? Apparently not. Okay. It doesn't require that I have a divine spark. It doesn't require any design. It doesn't require any programming. And I'm perfectly aware of the fact that a lot of people don't do it. Don't. And of course there are a lot of people who don't care about others at all. We call them sociopaths. And the design apparently also makes quite a lot of psychopaths, people who can only be happy, making other people unhappy. These are all children of God as well, according to you. It's not my problem. That's exactly what you would expect from the imperfectly evolved primate species. No mysteries there. Nothing to explain, nothing to call on God about. Why did you allow Hitler? We know where Hitler comes from. There's no, the principle of Occam's razor in logic and philosophy. Keep it by you at all times. Don't make mysteries where none exist. Don't increase the number of unnecessary and complex questions. Very important principle. It's death to religion, that principle.
Would you like to respond to that as well?
Maybe just follow up.
Only a few verses away, only a few verses later than the Ten Commandments, God instructs the children of Israel to kill everyone of the other tribe, the Amalekites, the Midianites, everybody, all the men, all the children, and to leave only the marriageable women alive. That is an instruction that's very frequently repeated, by the way, and invariably carried out. When Thomas Paine pointed that out in The Age of Reason a couple of centuries ago, there was a Welsh bishop who wrote in, complaining to him, saying, the Bible does not say those women were kept for immoral purposes. You're free to believe that if you wish. But if you're going to bring up rape and evolution and the way that humanity actually behaves, under divine instruction, I'm pointing out here, you must stop saying what I meant to correct you from saying earlier, that what I attack is what people do in the name of religion. No, they don't mistake religion when they obey commandments like this. What I object to is what's in the original instructions. And these are instructions for rape, genocide, and slavery. They are instruction manuals for it. And also, how to behave like a slave yourself. Just to come.
He has an atheistic worldview, and that has problems of itself. In a fallen world, no worldview is going to be perfect. It's not going to cover things. I mean, that's the problem. And so we do have a problem with evil. We have a problem with good. We have lots of problems.
We can either go back to questions or you can continue on. Do you have a response to that?
Well, in an evolutionary mammalian world, also quite obviously there is no perfect solution either. As I've said, I hardly need to say it once you've described that that's what we are, imperfectly evolved mammals on a short-lived planet. People now object to that, though it's true, and there's all the evidence is in its favor. We are poorly evolved mammals on a short-lived, rather endangered planet. People say, well, if you believe that, that's depressing, nihilistic, makes things seem so random and capricious and so on. Well, yes, but is it true or not? What is true of your view? What is true of your view, sir? Well, you've just said that God makes a human species, takes a brief look at it and decides it's in rebellion against me. It doesn't know how it's done this, but that's his verdict. You're in rebellion against me. For one thing, you've broken the rule I gave you, don't think for yourselves. You deliberately went and looked for knowledge. Now you're in rebellion. Now you're going to suffer. Now there's nothing that won't happen to you. I made you and I can break you. And I will. I'll flood you, I'll plague you. Now, what is this? This is like being a terrible insect or rodent in the laboratory of a cruel and stupid person. And what is more nihilistic? What's more nihilistic and alienating than that? It's all summarized in one line, if you wish. To believe what Dr. Dembski believes and his co-thinkers believe, you have to consider yourself created incurably sick and then ordered on pain of death and eternal torture to be well. This is not morality. In the early Christian years, there were many leaders of the early church who thought that Christianity should be a new religion, which it's not, unfortunately, for you. And the reason it'll never triumph is because it insists on shackling itself to the terrible books of the Jewish Old Testament. Now, great Christian thinkers like Marcion was the best known. There were Marcionite churches all over the Middle East, just for the study and worship of the message of the Nazarene. But it was decided no. The whole Nazarene story had to reverse engineer and prove the truth of the Old Testament books as well. And with this insufferable burden, you've saddled yourself with an unbelievable and wicked religion. It's a pity, I sometimes think. But I think there are deformities to the pure Christian religion too, and he mentioned the name I give to one of them. A doctrine that I think is strictly immoral, the idea of vicarious redemption. Now, though I say I don't think there's any historical definite proof of this person's existence, because all the accounts of him are so discrepant, there are so many of them that it's enough to persuade me that there must have been some such figure. And it's not that unlikely that there'd be a charismatic rabbi wandering in a region that was hungry for messiahs and kept on hoping to find them. It's not at all unlikely that there was one, or that he would have got in trouble with the Romans and been, as people were who get in trouble with the Romans, very harshly treated. This does not prove, it doesn't even suggest that his birth was divine, or that his father was God, or that his mother was a virgin. None of these things are remotely provable. They're not even really arguable. They can only be asserted. But suppose they are. I then have to be told that the torture and human sacrifice of somebody, which if I'd been present, it would have been my duty to try and prevent, which I did not ask for, over which I have no control, that took place thousands of years, according to some, before I was born, commits me, and that I have no choice in the matter, and that my sins are forgiven by this human sacrifice. Now, what's wrong with that? If I like you enough or love you enough, I can pay your debt. I say there was folly on your part, but I'll pay it for you. In extreme cases, people have been known to volunteer to take other people's place in prison, or even, one or two very famous cases, on the scaffold. They'll say, I'll do that for you. I'll do it for love, or I'll do it for suffering humanity. But that's the most they can do. And it's not bad. What they can't do is take away your sins, because that would be to take away your responsibility. I can't say you didn't steal or lose that money that I'm having to pay now. I can't say that this course of folly didn't get you into prison. It did. And now look what you're doing to me. I can't relieve you of that. I can't wash you white as snow and make you new again. It's more than can be promised and more than should be promised. Vicarious redemption is scapegoating. It's throwing your sins onto an animal. It's an old primitive practice from the Middle East. It doesn't deserve the attention of civilized or thoughtful people. So anyway, it's pervert. Let's admit, it's kindly offered to me. I give all these objections. I think it's highly implausible. I don't really believe the story. I didn't ask for it, and having considered it, I would rather carry on living, trying to lead a decent life without it. Okay, thanks. But thanks for asking. Oh no, sorry, you didn't hear us right the first time. It wasn't an offer. You refuse it on pain of death. Excuse me, I won't be talked to in that tone of voice. Something about me. I hope something about some of you too. What was that? I'm not free to refuse this offer? You're making me an offer I can't decline. Was that a threat? Are you saying that if I turn away from this lamb's blood, from which I'm supposed to be washed, and say I don't think it will clean me, say, well, that means an eternity of torture, you know. I hope you better take that into account before you consider our offer of eternal love. No, no, no. This is North Korea. This is celestial dictatorship. This is the worship that only a slave could take part in. Stephen Hawking's latest book on the Big Bang, the first one in which he actually says explicitly that it all works without God, in fact, works better without the idea of a creator, contains a statement with which I hugely want to disagree. He says that these latest discoveries in physics are also the death of philosophy. I don't want that to be true, because I'm not a scientist, and I revere philosophy. But what he means by it is this. There was a time when a philosopher, a natural philosopher, someone like Newton or Kant, could speculate about the natural world. That's why they were called natural scientists as well, and do better than many professionals could. For example, it was Kant sitting in a room in Königsberg after the Lisbon earthquake, when people for the first time began to doubt that earthquakes were caused by God or were judgments. This is only in the 18th century people began for the first time to wonder if these were verdicts, as the Christians had been telling them. Didn't seem to work anymore. Kant proposed the idea, it said it may seem fanciful, but perhaps there are underground caverns, some of them even below the sea, which sometimes cave in and lead to what he didn't call seismic events, because we didn't have a word for seismology then. But there were philosophers could do scientific work by speculating on the natural world and using their heads, as Lucretius could with the atoms. What Hawking means to say is this: we now may be beyond the point where you can say anything useful unless you are in fact a member of a certain scientific discipline. I really hope this isn't true for selfish reasons, but you have to take this thought very seriously. Now, Lawrence Krauss, who I think is one of the greatest living physicists, has a lecture which you can go to YouTube and have a look at. It's called A Whole Universe from Nothing. He explains how it is, how with what we now know about the quantum, which is perilously little, by the way, so far, but what we know about it, can claim to know, suggests that actually nothing from nothing isn't as much of a contradiction as it may seem. And that's about the origins of the matter. I recommend that to you. My only philosophical contribution, if you like, would be towards the end of the question, which is a little easier, I think. Whether we came from nothing or not, we are certainly headed for it, or it is headed for us. You may choose to believe that this tiny speck of a planet, in a bang which blows out a sun every second, a whole sun every second, and has done for 10 billion years, that all that happened so that we could be meeting here today. You can choose to believe that if you want to. It's just, it's not even disproportionate. It's simply refusing to use the new language and the new evidence as if they meant anything at all. But suppose that to be true if you wish, if you must. If you look in the sky, you can actually see the Andromeda galaxy heading towards us now. We know, physicists can tell you, the date on which our galaxy will collide with Andromeda. It can be seen with the naked eye, the future. It's over. We don't know whether that will happen first, or whether our sun will join the billions of suns that have blown up, or whether, now that we've discovered that Edwin Hubble's red light shift, showing the speed and rate of the expansion of the universe, the way in which it's flying apart, that, as I said earlier, that speed and rate, this was only found out a decade ago, is increasing all the time, completely contradicting everything we thought before. We're flying apart faster than we thought. A lot of nothingness is coming our way. Now, what design is that a part of, is what you have to ask yourself. Of what design, let alone of what benign design, could that conceivably be a part? This fantastic waste of energy, this gigantic profusion. Again, it makes God such a tinkerer and such a profligate, just as 99.8% of every species created on Earth since it started has been dispensed with, has gone extinct, has been surplus to requirements. What a waste, what a profusion, what a cruelty, if you want to give it a human or a spirited name. That's what you have to believe. That's the kind of tinkerer, the kind of capricious, incompetent tyrant, obviously so much modelled on our human experience of authority. As it's enough to convince me of what I'm now sure of. Man did not create God. Men and women created many, many, many gods, and always have since the dawn of our history, and still do. And one of those gods may be true, out of all of them, might be real, or all of them could be false, or all of them could be true. And the overwhelming probability, it seems to me, as the cults that attach to each of them, is that all of them are false, and for the same reason. They are made up by creatures half a chromosome away from being chimpanzees, and I'm afraid to say it shows. Thank you.
The subtitle of Hitchens' book reads, How Religion Poisons Everything. Gripped by the idea that religion poisons everything, he cannot allow that religious people, precisely because of their religion, might do good. Hitchens takes this idea to ridiculous extremes in his attack on Mother Teresa. In his 1994 BBC documentary, Hell's Angel, his 1995 book, The Missionary Position, and briefly, in God Is Not Great, Hitchens portrays her as a self-serving hypocrite. In the audience today is my good friend, Mary Poplin, a professor at Claremont. She was in Calcutta with Mother Teresa when Hitchens came out with his book against her. Recently, Poplin published Finding Calcutta, in which she recounts her time with Mother Teresa. Poplin writes, quote, and Poplin and the nuns there were reading your book while she was there. Hitchens also accused Mother Teresa of receiving the best in health care when it was not available to the poor. However, I took an offer to her from a colleague's brother who was involved in developing a new pacemaker to replace her old pacemaker with a new and improved one. She said she could not accept it, but she would accept it for the poor. She also refused another medical offer. When I called and repeated these offers upon her becoming more ill a few months after I left, and that was close to her death, she again refused and asked for prayers instead. My impression is that she mostly received good health care when she was too ill to fight it. And I think I'm going to leave it there rather abruptly. I think in my rhetoric course I would wrap things up, but I'm going to give Mother Teresa the last word. So that's where I'll leave it.
Oh, well. Well, Mother Teresa was a fanatic, a fundamentalist, and a fraud. She was not a friend of the poor, as she claimed to be. She was a friend of poverty. Preached it as a good thing, as a gift from God, something to be welcomed along with other kinds of suffering. Wasn't interested in alleviating it. Was a friend of the rich. Took money from the Duvalier family in Haiti, one of the most obscenely bloated dynastic dictatorships in history. Took money from Charles Keating, the man who robbed Americans blind through the Lincoln Savings and Loan. Stolen money. All to build convents in her own name, more than 200 of them around the world, in order to found an order that bore her name. This is not modesty either, nor is it humility. It doesn't exhaust my critique of her either. We all know there is a cure for poverty. It's a rudimentary one. It does work, though. It works everywhere for the same reason. It's colloquially called the empowerment of women. It's the only thing that does work. If you allow women some control over their cycle of reproduction, so that they're not chained by their husbands or by village custom to annual animal-type pregnancies, early death, disease, and so on. If you will free them from that, give them some basic health of that sort, and if you are generous enough to throw in perhaps a handful of seeds and a bit of credit, the whole floor, culturally, socially, medically, economic, of that village will rise. It works every time. Mother Teresa spent her entire life campaigning against that outcome. She said that contraception was equivalent to abortion morally, and abortion was morally equivalent to murder. She was entirely against the only thing that cures poverty. I would say that her preachments led to an enormous increase in the amount of poverty, ignorance, filth, and disease in the world. And I would further add, without embarrassment, that it's off those things that the Roman Catholic Church has always fed and made its living. Otherwise, there would have been no need for the Protestant Revolution, which brings us here today. And believe me, I barely started with that terrible person. Now, as I said before, you can be an atheist in anything you like. You can be an atheist in the Marquis de Sade. You can be an atheist and be a great humanist. I mean, most of the missionary work, work done by Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, by Oxfam, by many other people in the stricken parts of the globe which I've visited, done by people who are not doing it to proselytize for their faith. They're not doing it handing out Bibles. surreptitiously. They're not doing it for any such reason. They're doing it for its own sake. That's a beautiful humanism, and I admire it. I even think it has a slight superiority, and there's no hidden agenda to it. But I'm not going to have Nazism called secularism, if you don't mind. I'm a prisoner of what I know here. I know too much about it. I've read Mein Kampf, for example, which most people have not, where Hitler says several times, starting very early on, that he's doing God's work in exterminating the Jews. He went on saying that. The Vatican was shown the book. In those days, they would ban any book they didn't like the look of. They were one of the great book banning organizations in the world. They didn't ban the book that was written by the leader who made his first political treaty in Germany with them and their church, and outside Germany between his dictatorship and the Vatican. If you wanted to take your oath, well, you didn't have to want to, you had to, if you were in the German army or in the SS, to take your oath to the Führer, which was compulsory. You took it like this: I swear by Almighty God, undying fealty. Around your belt, if you were a soldier in the Nazi army, you had to wear a buckle that said Gott mit uns, the German for God on our side. Like every other form of totalitarianism and fanaticism, this is religious in itself, and it was not, as it was in some other countries, the Christian right in power, but it was the Christian right subsumed into a party that involved various other terrible mutations too. So I just have to defend myself, it seems to me, on these two matters. I'll close on the implied question that Bill asked me earlier. Why don't you accept this wonderful offer? Why wouldn't you like to meet Shakespeare, for example? I mean, I don't know if you really think that when you die you can be corporeally reassembled and have conversations with authors from previous epochs. It's not necessary that you believe that in Christian theology, and I have to say it sounds like a complete fairy tale to me. The only reason I want to meet Shakespeare, or might even want to, is because I can meet him any time, because he is immortal in the works he's left behind. If you've read those, meeting the author would almost certainly be a disappointment. But when Socrates was sentenced to death for his philosophical investigations and for blasphemy, for challenging the gods of the city, and he accepted his death, he did say, well, if we are lucky, perhaps I'll be able to hold conversation with other great thinkers and philosophers and doubters too. In other words, that the discussion about what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is pure and what is true could always go on. Why is that important? Why would I like to do that? Because that's the only conversation worth having. And whether it goes on or not after I die, I don't know. But I do know that it's the conversation I want to have while I'm still alive. Which means that to me, the offer of certainty, the offer of complete security, the offer of an impermeable faith that can't give way, is an offer of something not worth having. I want to live my life taking the risk all the time that I don't know anything like enough yet, that I haven't understood enough, that I can't know enough, that I'm always hungrily operating on the margins of a potentially great harvest of future knowledge and wisdom. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd urge you to look at those of you who tell you, those people who tell you at your age, that you're dead till you believe as they do. What a terrible thing to be telling to children. And that you can only live. And that you can only live by accepting an absolute authority. Don't think of that as a gift. Think of it as a poisoned chalice. Push it aside, however tempting it is. Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.